Hello, welcome. My name is Shenzhan Liao, Senior Vice President of China Institute. Welcome to join today's program, One in a Billion, One Man's Remarkable Odyssey Through Modern Day China. I can see many familiar names of old friends of China Institute. For those of you who are new to us, we are located in downtown Manhattan in New York City. We have been doing our mission-driven programs to advance a deeper understanding of China and bridge US-China understanding since 1926. Today, we do programs both online and in person. And if you are in New York City, do visit our gallery showcasing exquisite, authentic Chinese art, attend our classes through our School of Chinese Studies, or join a public program like this evening's of a topic of your interest on site at China Institute. Before I introduce our speaker today, just a few housekeeping matters. The program will be recorded and accessible on our YouTube channel after the program. We will have a Q&A towards the end of the program. Please share your comments, thoughts, and questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And of course, you can also do that during any time of the program. Now, please allow me to introduce our distinguished speaker, author of the book, One in a Billion, Dr. Nancy Pine. Dr. Pine, could you turn on your camera? Hi, Dr. Pine.
Hello, hello from California.
Dr. Nancy Pine is a professor emerita at Mount St. Mary's University, Los Angeles. She directed the elementary education program and the Bridging Cultures US-China program there. She has done cross-cultural researches in China and the United States for over 20 years. And has published over 30 education and research articles, many related to China or cross-cultural learning, and has given talks and workshops throughout the United States and internationally. Dr. Pine has spent extended periods in rural China, including 5 monthly visits to one village to teach teachers from neighboring communities, consult in local school, and learn about rural life. Her recent book, One in a Billion, One Man's Remarkable Odyssey Through Modern Day China, grew from that experience. Our program this evening will start with a presentation by Dr. Pine to give a quick look of the book, followed by a moderated dialogue between me and Dr. Pine before open to the audience. Now, I will turn the screen to Dr. Pine, please.
Right, and good evening and good morning and good afternoon, depending where in the world you are. And I'm going to go very quickly through this PowerPoint. So this is going to be a very quick trip through 7 decades of An Wei's life. An Wei is the central figure of One in a Billion. And we're going to do this in about 15 minutes. So very quickly, an overview first. He went to elementary school, then in his village, then junior middle school in town. During junior middle school, the Great Leap Forward began, and then he went on to senior middle school when starvation took over for 3 years. And after that, he went on to college. And then right after he graduated from college, the Cultural Revolution began. He actually was eventually sent to the Yan'an area to a re-education camp. But eventually he became an interpreter for world leaders and plenty more. 1949, People's Republic of China began. The communist troops entering Beijing came in September 1949, and they, a month later, the beginning of the People's Republic of China was announced. He went in elementary school, which was in his village. He was the only one in his family to go to school. He loved school and studied hard. And it was actually, he began in fall of 1950, which was the first year of the People's Republic of China and the first year of schools in his village ever. He went to grades 1 through 4 in Anjiang village in a temple school, and then one room, one teacher, and then on to a neighboring town for 5th and 6th grade. Village life was very difficult. Water was scarce. He said they were almost always hungry. They had one set of clothes per season, and the housing was varied. He and his family lived in a homestead, but many villagers also lived in caves, actually up until the 1980s. He went on to junior middle school. He passed the exams for it. And in September 1956, his older brother showed him the 10 kilometers of paths to go down into the valley to the large school. Partway through junior middle school, Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward, and the young people were more than enthusiastic to help because they appreciated all of the improvements that he was making in their lives. For Anhui, for instance, having school in their village. He loved school. He worked hard to become the best in his class. He wanted to be a leader. These photographs are, which Anhui found actually, are sort of representative of what middle school was like then. The Great Leap Forward began in 1958 when the country went into high gear to improve the economy, the agricultural production, and plenty else. There were a number of things in the movement: land reform and the forming of communes across the country. They were encouraged to kill the 4 pests, 3 of which were disease-producing: flies, rats, mosquitoes, and sparrows. Also, the government manufactured simple tractors that actually revolutionized some of agriculture. There were big problems too. The killing of the sparrows actually left the insect populations unchecked, and making backyard steel became a really multi-pronged disaster. In the United States, audiences really heard only about the disasters, not the accomplishments. Fufang Senior Middle School, he went on to, the exam to get there was very hard. In 1959, he was very excited to go and enter the senior high school or the senior middle school. And this photograph actually is from his school, which he found on the internet. Again, he worked enormously hard and aimed for college. He was always trying to become a leader, to do the very best he could. And going to college, teachers warned them that rural students would have a very difficult time passing the exam, but they should try. But as they were going through this, the crops were getting smaller and smaller, and food was becoming scarcer and scarcer, and starvation set in and lasted for 3 years. Anhui said it was the worst period of his life, and he studied harder and harder so that he would never have to be a farmer and live in those conditions. So he actually, with several others, managed to pass the exam, and he passed with very high marks. The college he was assigned to was the Xi'an Foreign Languages Institute in Xi'an, where he was to major in English. And this picture on the right is actually the building that he and his wife attended classes. Anhui on the first floor, his class was on the first floor, her class was on the second floor, and those buildings were still there in 2006. Anhui worked again enormously hard. He ended up studying twice as much as most of the other students. And he really by then felt the responsibility to do as much as possible with his education, because it was a privilege and he was the only one in his village to have an education. He became a member of the Communist Party, and he finished in June 1966, when the school had selected him to go to England, improve his English, and come back as an instructor in English for the Institute. However, 1 week after Anhui completed those years of education, the Cultural Revolution began, with millions targeted, especially the political elites and the educated. The students had to stay at the college for about 2 years. And of course, all the plans like going to England went out the window. Because Anhui was a top student and also had worked and collaborated with the college administrator, the Red Guards went after people like him. And so he was in pretty great danger the first year. He managed to figure out how to survive without giving in to everything that they wanted. And in 2 years, the government actually decided that it was important for these college graduates to go get jobs. And so he actually ended up as an interpreter for the Foreign Affairs Office of Shanxi Province, which was in Xi'an. And there was little work to do, though, because there were a few foreign visitors that were coming. During that time, he and Miu Jianhua were married. And soon thereafter, he was sent to the re-education school, Naniwan, in the north to learn from farmers. The conditions, he said, were terrible. The work was miserable. And this is he said he used to carry the flag. This is a picture actually from Naniwan and in the 1970s, but even today, it looks rather similar to this. When he went there, he took with him what was required, which was the Chinese volumes of Mao Zedong's writing and the little red book that had Mao Zedong's quotations in it. But Anhui also took with him the English volumes because he thought maybe it would help him maintain his English. And it was also, he found he could learn a lot by reading them in the footnotes that were written for foreigners about historical events. He did manage to keep them, but the commandant actually tried to get him to turn them in, and he outwitted the commandant, but he realized that he really needed to be careful. So from then on, he studied English secretly, going up into the hills there. That is a picture of Naniwan, and practicing his English secretly. The picture on the right is of the cave that he and another person who was at the camp stayed in, and they managed to get out of the dormitories that were smelly and very unpleasant. About a year later, a year and a half, Anhui was transferred unexpectedly to the Yan'an History Museum to rewrite history. The food, he said, was better. The dangerous task of rewriting history, he managed to try to sidestep, and he found a tiny little room where he could be by himself and study. Best of all, after several years of being able to read only Mao Zedong's writings, he was ordered to go to the reading room of the museum and find out everything he could about the history of the Communist Party. In that room was collected a lot of books by foreigners who had also written about China, including those of Edgar Snow and Helen Foster Snow. And he was shocked because he had always been told that the Westerners all hated China, but there were obviously some, and he was especially struck by the book and by the bravery of Helen Foster Snow. Also, his wife had their first baby, a daughter. She was in Xi'an still, and so they were separated by hundreds of kilometers. but they did get to see each other a little bit. And then by mistake, he blurted out some English, and the officials heard him. And that was a somewhat dangerous thing to do because many people were being punished for using English, but they were desperate for interpreters. And so he was transferred to the Foreign Affairs Office in Yan'an, and he became their interpreter and host for English-speaking visitors. He realized that his life was getting better during the Cultural Revolution in spite of awful things that were going on in the country. In the Foreign Affairs Office, he learned the ropes of being hosting English-speaking foreigners. He learned and studied very hard the protocols, so he did everything perfectly, practiced his English, and actually learned to be with a lot of different cultural groups that he'd never experienced before, some of whom he found were doing shocking things. In 1974, Anwei was reassigned to the Xi'an Foreign Affairs Office where he had originally been hired. He ended up living in a basement in a small shared room, still 3 hours from his family. And again, he was the only staff member proficient enough in English to actually be an interpreter for foreigners. So his first visitor at the age of 32 was the former British Prime Minister, Edward Heath. And next came the Queen of the Netherlands, and then there were plenty more, week after week after week. Henry Kissinger came in 1979. He was doing working nonstop, building his skills and working round the clock almost. But there were people in the office who were getting jealous of him because he had these wonderful assignments, and he was doing things that, and he wasn't spending time with them. So in 1978, he had a real treat. He ended up being assigned to host Helen Foster Snow, and he'd read her book when he was in Yan'an, and he actually had admired her. She was the first wife of Edgar Snow, and she had escaped from Chiang Kai-shek's guards and spent months in Yan'an interviewing Long March survivors and leaders of the Communist Party. She and her video crew had come in 1978 to recapture that experience, but she was so impressed with Anwei and his knowledge and skill that she contacted him afterward, and that began years of working together, and it benefited both of them. He had plenty of interesting experiences. One person he really enjoyed a lot was Jimmy Carter, who wanted to visit a farming village. Carter was brought up as a farmer, and those three people there are Carter, Anwei, and the head farmer of the village, and they just had a wonderful couple of days together. In 1982, he began foreign travel. His first trip was to the United States, and he sought to interpret for two officials. They began with a whirlwind tour of New York City, and he often talked about going especially to the United Nations and the Statue of Liberty, and the United Nations where everyone was, all the countries were there talking with each other. Other adventures and projects, he created lots of different programs and projects on the side in his free time. And he also became the leader of his village and brought many improvements to it, including starting a democratic Congress that lasted 5 years. So the last decade, he has concentrated on working with young people to translate more of Helen Snow's work. He and his wife and some other people had done a lot of translating already. But now there's a group of young professors at Xi'an's Northwest University who are working on a lot of her contributions and her detailed work on the history of China, because she and her husband were there in the 1930s. And so now there are actually exhibition that's traveling from town to city, and he continues to work on this. So that's Anwei's life so far in a very short version.
Thank you, Dr. Pine, for
Right.
that thoughtful presentation. I have your book in my hand because I know how hard it is, well, to put Anwei's entire life in these slides. So many details, and especially one person's life through China's modern history.
Right.
It's really weaving a lot of big events, major historical stages together with one individual's life. Because when I'm reading your book, I keep thinking when China is a topic, often it feels so vast to grasp, especially given its history, size, and diversity. So what inspired you to write about a modern day China history through the experience of one person's life? That is Anwei in your book.
Right. Well, it took a while, but for 10, I had been going to China. I was traveling back and forth between China and the United States, doing research in educational development of young children and also consulting in schools. And so I have been doing that for 10 years before I met Anwei. And during those 10 years, I had met lots and lots of people and gotten to know them very well. We worked together on research, but we spent a lot of time conversing. And there were a few people who really stood out as being who sort of, as I learned more about their lives, I thought telling the United States population and other people in the West actually about these lives would help them get to know China better and the history that everyone was living through. And these people, I realized, had all been born around the time that the People's Republic of China began. And they also were people who were pretty focused in what they wanted to do and accomplish. And so they went through all the ups and downs of China, like Anwei has, but and they sort of, there are lots of downtimes, lots of difficult times, but they somehow managed to survive them and keep their values as they were going. So there was, for example, one person who was was an expert in early childhood education. She had started by learning from Russian experts in preschool education. She had learned Russian. She had then practiced and tried to help people get preschool started in China. This was a long time ago. And then did lots of things. In the Cultural Revolution, she had a terrible time. And she's very feisty. I mean, I did a couple of research projects with her, and she she was very opinionated, very strong-willed, and we had plenty of discussions about how to do things. The one problem that I had in telling her story, which she was willing to have me do, was that we struggled with language because she had taught herself English just privately after she had retired. And my Chinese would get me a banana at the local shop, but it certainly wouldn't go very far beyond that. So then I met Anwei, and so introduced to me by a friend. And as I got to know him and got to spend time in his village, I began to realize that his story was probably the one that, if it was possible to tell it, would be probably the best one for Americans and Westerners in general to be able to see that a personal narrative of the history of modern China. So that's how I ended up. That's a long story, but it started long before Anwei, actually.
Indeed. I love the fact that you mentioned how language plays a big role here. that Anwei, from a village in China, but ended up studying English and went to the college, and then that has changed his entire life. So I keep thinking education is a major changing force of Anwei's life. Is this something unique of Anwei as a person, or his experience reflects something more characteristic of China as a society?
I've thought about this a lot as I've written the book, and it took me I interviewed him for 10 years, and it took even longer to write the book. So it's given me a lot of time to think about things like this. And he actually, I thought about education in relation to him in two ways. One is that, I think people in developing countries in general really, really value education and are pretty sure that if they're going to get out of poverty, if they're going to advance, they need to have an education. But I think in China, that's sort of multiplied by 3, at least, as far as people's belief in the importance of education. And obviously this goes back centuries and centuries. So in that way, his drive in education was just like everyone else's in China. But then he also sort of stood out because he not only sort of really worked twice as hard as everyone else in school and felt the responsibility of carrying forward something for his whole village and for many people in China who didn't have the experience and the privilege that he had of an education. And also, he was just curious. And so all through his life, he's wanted to learn. He's wanted to get more education in one way or another, including with programs that he started in which he was always making sure that he understood the laws that underlay them, things that would affect them, the context. So it's a continuous learning process. And I'm not sure that answered all of your question, but that's sort of the view. So the title of 1 in a Billion, basically, I began to realize was one that sort of told about his desire to always learn, which sort of made him different from many people, but also his life represents that of people, a lot of people. So it's sort of twofold.
Yeah, absolutely. As well, I can see some of the comments and questions just coming in, and our participants have a lot of questions about the book regarding Anwei's life, as you just shared, as well as about the book and some larger questions. Some of the facts actually related to just what you shared, Dr. Pine. First of all, did Anwei still alive? And
oh goodness, yes. And he was hoping to be part of the audience today. I don't know whether he's there or not, but he sent me an email saying he and his friends were going to be here. So I hope they've made it.
Yeah, and some of the improvements you mentioned in the end that he made in his village. Can you talk a little bit more about specifically what improvements he brought back to his village?
There are a number of things. He was a complicated set of reasons why he ended up being back in the village and becoming the leader. But there were things, there were simple things like the phone towers, because when I first started going there, in fact, if you had a cell phone, which some of the villagers had, you went out in the middle of a field somewhere to try to pick up a signal. And so several years later, there were 2 phone towers in the village. So, there were sort of simple things like that, but he also brought a lot of dynamic interplay with having festivals that brought lots of people in from the countryside, from other villages. So they would there would be lots of announcements and lots of drums and things, and he would bring the villagers from other villages to Anjiang to enjoy the things that were going on, including the opera company from Fufang County, which would come and perform for several days. He also there are a lot of things that were going on. He eventually, because he realized that the farmers were very distressed by things that had happened in the past, he drew from Helen Snow's experiences in China and the cooperative movement, which is a whole nother piece that's described a little bit in the book, but and elsewhere also, that he actually thought that if he could figure out how they could do it, they could help control their own lives and not just be overrun by people who are out to help themselves and no one else. And as the Chinese saying goes, the people who are taking taking the feathers off the goose as it flew by. And so he that was sort of the most powerful thing he did. But in the process of doing that, there was just a lot of other dynamic improvement of things, from having to do with payments of fees, of various things, of outwitting some of the corrupt people in the nearby town who oversaw some things. They figured out how to stop them from doing that by locking the teachers out of this and the principal out of the school at the beginning of a year. That really brought a lot of response very quickly, and it was done very cleverly. So that's just a few things, but enough.
Well, that's a great. Those are great examples demonstrating how detailed the story that you shared, that Anwei did. And that's one part I really love your book. It's really a treasure. It's because when we hear about improvements or the different stages in China's modern history, it's as we are reading from books, it still feels so much distance in it. But then really through these details that we can see things happening, and that's unfolding, that's affecting people's life, in fact.
Right.
Yeah, and I want to go back a little bit because at the very beginning he studied very hard, and there have been extraordinary historical movements that his life has gone through. And China in itself is an amazing story, and in many aspects, a success story, where millions of people were lifted out of poverty, and as a country has risen to the second largest economy in the world. And through reading his life, we know that during China's rising, it has gone through dramatic ups and downs, such as Cultural Revolution, 1989, that in your book all touches Anwei's life. So, and presented tremendous hardships to individuals like Anwei. So what do you think contributes to Anwei's successful navigation through those periods?
Oh, that's complicated. I'm not sure I can do justice to that question, but let me try a little bit. I think there's unfortunately, I don't remember the word, but he said in the village dialect, there is a word he said that really described him. And what I'm remembering it being was that he was stubborn and just always determined to do something. When he was 3 years old or 2 years old, he he had temper tantrums, and no one could ever stop him. He just had to roll around on the ground until he exhausted himself. So he was stubborn in a way, but it was a productive way. So once he got into school, he was going to succeed, period. And I think that kind of drive, he was going to do things that he went along with a lot of things of the government. I mean, he really admired the government, as did young people, for many, many years. And it was the Cultural Revolution that just sort of stood everything on its head, because suddenly education was worth nothing and only the illiterate farmers knew anything. I mean, that's sort of a simplified version of what was going on in the Cultural Revolution. But so he continued that strong drive and personality, but he was going to accomplish something, period, no matter what it was. And if one example is the shed for the cattle was in their backyard once the communes formed and their village became part of a commune. And the person who oversaw the cattle really somehow had it out for Anhui. And every time Anhui came to get I guess it was a cow. I mean, it's not a cow. I can't think of it. The animal that you grind grain with. He actually found he would give Anhui the slowest animal. And so Anhui one day said, he walked in, and before the guy knew what was happening, Anhui, in fact, took a really good one and took it out to do the milling for grinding flour. And then he had to figure out how to deal with this guy when he returned the cow or the animal. I'm sorry. It's escaping me what they are. They're not buffalo either. So, but he figured out how to basically shame the man without doing it publicly. So that was a very careful thing that he did. He thought through how to say to this man that he was doing the wrong thing and he shouldn't always single Anhui out to give him the worst animal. Whereas he said, you can give me the worst animal some, but not every single time. And so he shamed the man, but only in private. So, I mean, that's just a small example of how he sort of has negotiated in many ways through many complicated situations and very difficult. I mean, and as I said very briefly with the PowerPoint, when he took those English volumes to Naniwan, and the commandant tried to get him to turn him in, again, that was in private. And he really outwitted the commandant, who had very little education. But he realized that there were other commanders there who would have more education and would go after him. And so he was just very careful in doing things. And he always had good intentions, basically, I think, through thick and thin. So those are just a few little pieces. So
yeah, good intentions. It also just reminds me some other stories in your book, even in later time when he was traveling to the United States and back in China or doing some work in the village. There are always obstacles.
Yes,
but he's always doing that with good intentions, and two, he has his own way to work out individually with people and also I would say his ability to understand how individuals work
Yes.
in the system.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
that really, well, you have all the stories, sort of like, well, giving examples one after another for that.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, and there are plenty of examples in the book of him negotiating through various very complex things. And he was also, which I think of as being, to overgeneralize, a very, really common Chinese trait. He was very patient. he,
Yeah.
he didn't expect anything to happen overnight.
Well, I have a question here from an audience in Minnesota,
Mhm.
who had a long and fruitful relationship with Anwei through the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, and well, we can learn from your book that, well, through working with many organizations in the United States and bringing like volunteers and, well, visitors, well, to China, Anwei truly made friends across the culture, cross borders. So this question is, first of all, your biography of Anwei is awesome. Really
Thank
a
you.
good read.
Right.
The question is there something in Anwei's perspective on life that could help us improve the current relationship between the US and China?
Boy, that is a, if I had the answer to that, we would have, I broadcast it across the sky, I think. But I think, if we could all step back and just think about China, and from in the other direction about people in the United States as being human beings, and there's a lot of humanity and good feelings. I mean, there's lots in common, lots and lots and lots in common. Actually, I think one small group that is succeeding some at this is the Helen Foster Snow Foundation people, who are, Adam Foster is a nephew. I'm not sure. He's related to Helen Foster Snow, but they actually do have programs that I don't know much about in China. They've managed to stay in contact. And in fact, he wrote to Xi Jinping at one point, not too long ago, and basically saying what we'd all like to say. It would be very nice to be able to carry on and look at things the way the Snows, Helen Snow and Anwei built bridges all the time. And he actually got a response back from Xi Jinping privately. So, but whether or not that adds up to anything, but that's just one tiny little speck of, if we could somehow get more communication. And of course, this happened when I was not out of college too long. I worked with a group of young Americans who were very interested in making contact with China at a time when there was a committee of 1 million to keep Red China out of the United Nations. And, it seemed hopeless, but those of us who had just finished college or were close to that were very interested in figuring out how to make contact with them. And of course, other European countries were already in contact, and the United States was much slower in making contact with China. We were still saying that China was one small island off the landmass, which was then called Formosa, and that those other billion or so people really didn't exist, which was crazy. So, and then it sort of changed. It's all the dynamics, and people, of course, have studied this, but things do change, and it is possible to change. Right now, it's just the newspapers and the governments just seem to be heading in exactly the wrong way, and it's very dangerous. So everything we can do to just make contacts, and there are small ways, and there are students who are beginning to, at least US students are beginning to go back to China. So not many, but compared to in the past, but it's beginning to happen some. And I think we need to do it more and more. So
Indeed, we need to do more and more and make more contact. Because we're talking about change, well, as you said just now, things do change.
right.
And you mentioned were two individuals who are standing out in your book. Of course, An Wei, the other one, Helen Foster Snow.
Right.
Thinking about the 1930s when Helen was first in China and An Wei's time, and we're looking at where we are today. Things do change a lot, and how we are, coping with that. Well, I'm learning a lot from your book, from An Wei's story, and especially the story that you focused on between An Wei and Helen Snow. Just so beautiful.
Good, very good. That was
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Why did you focus on that story when you wrote An Wei's life?
I think I'd say that An Wei actually did that for me, because as he talked about his life, Helen Snow was obviously extremely important. And first, I think when he was in Yan'an and he read her book, he was just amazed at her bravery and her tenacity in getting to Yan'an. She climbed out a window of the hostel where Chiang Kai-shek's guards were keeping her. And at night, she climbed out a window and basically escaped from them and made it to Yan'an, which was a very difficult trip. And she was there for a number of months. Her husband had been there first, but it turned out evidently that the time she went was more dangerous, because the nationalist troops were after the communists, and it was very dangerous to try, and they were trying to keep everyone away from them. So anyone who was caught was not in good shape. So that was the very beginning. And then when suddenly in 78, he was assigned to oversee this group coming from the United States with video crew, and it turned out to be Helen Snow. It was almost to him miraculous, I think, that he was actually getting to meet her. And so he really doubled down and did even more to make sure she had a wonderful time, including taking her to the place where she had climbed out the window and a few other things. And she was just very impressed, not just by his language skills, but his knowledge about everything that had been important to her life when she was in China. And so that was the beginning. And then he ended up, with the help of Sharon Crane, who lived rather close to Helen Snow in Connecticut. And they worked together along with a videographer who had come with her. The three of them really worked to try to sort of publicize and get her work out, which had been hidden. She had done a lot of work that contributed to Edgar Snow's book, Red Star Over China, but it was all credited to him. And so there was a number of situations like that in which her work was subsumed by people who had more power. And so An Wei just became very dedicated in trying to get her knowledge, which was very important. She'd done a lot of writing about the 1930s and what was going on in China. And she was very detailed. She had all the dates, all the people, etc. And it's important history for China. So he's done a lot of translating. His wife has done a lot of translating, as have many of the young professors at Xi'an Northwest University and plenty others. So just became, I mean, it was a huge part of his life and an influence on him.
Yeah.
And
So
she was very tough to work with, I think is the word. She was a challenge.
well, it's by people working together and also generations of people working
Yes.
together.
Yes, right.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Adam Foster. Actually, Mr. Foster is in the audience right now.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Right.
So he does have a question. And I think,
Okay.
well, this is a question a lot of audience want to know as well. Is the book available in China?
Oh, the translation process, I have been through translating with my first book, which is Compares Chinese and American Education. And so I've learned a little bit of how the process goes. The publishing house that publishes in the United States then is the one that oversees the translation. So that first book of mine was translated in China, but I didn't have anything to do with it until my publishers sold the rights of translation to a publishing house in China. And so it all goes on between the publishing house and their contacts. So as I understand it, and this is about as much information as I'll ever end up with. I know that there are people in China who would like to translate it, that I know. But in fact, I believe my publishing house, Roman and Littlefield, has contacted their translation contact in China, and I don't know where it's gone from there, and I won't know. I mean, working your way through the bureaucracy of a publishing house is not worth the time it takes. So,
Well,
yeah,
we have already had a lot of questions coming in, and I'm asking those questions already. So I'm just inviting the audience. Well, please, share your comments or questions. Continue in doing that as well. I'm going through these questions. Maybe I cannot go through all of them, but we will share all this with Dr. Fine after the program.
Good. Thank you. That's very good. And yeah. I just want to make, this is not a, that I do have a website, and if you want to contact me and haven't had your question answered, I would be glad to answer it. There's a way to contact me at the bottom of every page of the website. So it is just nancypine.com. So.
There's a question, in fact, related to the book and on the topic of education, because we talked about how education being a major force for changing Anwei's life. And he kept thriving from learning. So there's a question about, nowadays Chinese graduates with advanced degrees are finding it very hard to get jobs. That is commensurate with their education, which presents a challenge to China. I feel it's perhaps not unique in China. But your book about education of Anwei's continuous desire for educational improvement is very obvious in your book, in his story. What kind of suggestions would you make for Chinese young people's outlook for their educations, given their career prospects today? I know you are also authoring a book about young people's education in China. Right. So if you could share some insights on this, that would be great.
I have to preface this by the fact that once you're not in the location, it's very hard to know what's really going on. So because I was able during this wonderful period between 1990 and 2017, basically, to be able to go back and forth, there's just a lot of exchange and freedom of communication, et cetera, with, of course, lots of students coming and going, et cetera. And of course, that's now missing. So what's happening now, and it was happening during the last years that I've been in China, was that students, there were more and more colleges being created, some private and some that were sort of attached to bigger universities, so that there were various combinations of educational pursuit and lots of young people going to college, which hadn't been possible before that, because there were a lot of limited by just the number of colleges and the seats in the colleges. So, and they were beginning at that point to have trouble with getting jobs and feeling that they really wanted to be in the very best universities, because then they could get to the best, to the best jobs, et cetera. But there's just been, as I understand it, and I am not an expert on this, that there really has been just a lot of over. There are many more students than there are jobs, especially since now there are a lot of economic issues going on, and somewhat caused by COVID, some by the international situation, et cetera, economically. And so how those students deal with things are different. There is a wonderful book, I think, called it's actually on my blog. The blockchain chicken, I just saw it on my bookshelf, blockchain chicken farm and other uses of technology, basically in rural China. And so when you read about these things, and the author has gone to many different places and looks into all different uses of technology. And the fact is that I think one thing that, as I understand it, and I could be dead wrong, is that many of the students who are actually graduating from a university want to be in the big jobs in the big cities, whereas but there are opportunities in a lot of other places, and some people are going back to their villages, going back to small towns, and creating things that are very creative. Who would think that you would have a blockchain chicken farm? I mean, a chicken farm run using blockchain technology. But there are people who are doing these things, and I think very creatively. But it's not as prestigious feeling, I think, for those who have gone through all the college work, and they want to be somewhere important, rather than sort of backing up and saying, okay, I can't get a job in Beijing, and maybe if I were there, I didn't want to be there anyway. I mean, some people are beginning to leave, but there are opportunities. It is a huge country, and with a lot of people, and there are lots and lots of needs and opportunities, but you have to sort of think outside the box. And I think many Chinese are able to do that. I know that parents worry about their kids, and I've had many discussions about how can they ever become creative if they're going to have to memorize textbooks for 18 years. But in fact, I think I've seen a lot of creativity, especially in the economic sector. And I think that's one thing that I would hope that more and more young Chinese would feel it's okay to do that. I mean, it's not a step down. They're being creative, and who knows where it will lead them.
Well, with that, we are in fact coming to the end of today's program. My colleague Jen Qing, working behind the scene, has shared Dr. Pine's website in the chat. So if you, you can find it there. We also have many comments that I don't have time to go through. I was planning to ask Dr. Pine to read one last page from her book. That will take 3 minutes, but I feel it's still worth listening. And Dr. Pine, do you mind reading it?
No, that's fine. I'll try to keep it right at 3 minutes.
It's beautifully, I have to say, I really enjoy reading your book. It's beautifully written. And I invite all the audience. I know many of you are knowing An Wei or have worked with him or knowing Dr. Pine. And for most of us or all of us, we are in it, just like An Wei or Dr. Pine or many individuals that this book mentions.
Yeah.
That we are cross-culturally on the bridge between US and China. Things are changing, but we're hopeful, just like this amazing, remarkable individual An Wei has showed us. So Dr. Pine, could you read it?
Yes, I would be glad to. All right, just a few paragraphs here. Who would have thought that the little boy with almost no chance to leave the poverty of a peasant village in the middle of China could accomplish all this? He had picked up the books his brother threw down and dusted them off with the eagerness to find out what was in them, to explore whatever they might offer. At the dawn of modern China, that impoverished young boy of 8 years old longed to explore the unknown world beyond the village paths. Becoming literate drew him into new worlds. Stubborn persistence pulled him through upheavals and obstacles. His father's refusal to pay his tuition, starvation during high school, and all the turmoil he dealt with throughout his life. As so many millions of Chinese have done, An Wei worked hard like his parents. Because he came from a rural family, though, perseverance was even more crucial for survival. He worked twice as hard as most students, committed not only to succeed, but also to be the best, to be a leader. Throughout his life, he constantly observed everything around him and asked why. Driven by curiosity and a desire to give a talented and forgotten woman her due, he immersed himself in reviving Helen Snow's work and cementing her legacy as one of the first Westerners to document the very birth of modern China. In the process, he drank deeply from her wisdom and took on her cause to promote the far-reaching importance of Chinese-American relations, mutual understanding, and cooperation. He was determined to see as far into the future as possible and to figure out what would happen if he tested new ideas. He created new ways of doing things in his village, from developing a technique for grinding flour as a boy to establishing a groundbreaking local democratic Congress that functioned for more than 5 years. When confronted with unexpected changes and obstacles, he doubled down on work, learned new skills, and used every task he was given to make connections between people and help foreign visitors understand China better. That has been his life's mission, and he has never given up.
Thank you, Dr. Pine.
Right. Thank you, Wei.
Yes, thanks to An Wei. Well, he's joining from China. We want to hear from him in the Q&A, but also thanks to all the audience who are being here and will join in the discussion. And well, some of you have read the book, and also, well, you may find many remarkable stories in the book when you read it. Again, thanks for joining today's program. Hope to see you all soon, either at China Institute or during our online programs. And please join us as members or students to support our work. Looking forward to seeing you more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here.